Okay. Well, again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We've got some really interesting presentations that I'm excited to share with everyone, and I hope everyone enjoys all the presentations today and learns a lot. Let me get this presentation sharing. It's not working because I'm trying to do that. Okay, our first speaker today is Amie Robison. Amie is an aquatic ecologist currently acting as CEO and co-owner of Robison Wildlife Solutions, which specializes in providing pond and lake management and restoration services to private landowners throughout Oklahoma. She also sits on the board of directors for the Watershed movement, run and founded by Kim Elkin, who happens to be our next guest speaker. Amie has an MS in zoology with an emphasis in aquatic ecotoxicology from Oklahoma State University and a BS in biology in their fisheries program from Southeastern Oklahoma State University. Let me try to get the presentation to cooperate. Oh, I need to do this. There we go. I'm going to have to stop sharing and try resharing. So I have really confused my computer. So I think I know the problem here. Pardon my technical difficulties. Okay, Kimberly, can you see the slides?
Yep, we're still good.
Perfect. Okay, just had to figure out where the window was. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, and with that, I will let you take it away, Amie. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, again, thanks for having me. We're just going to go over some of the horror stories that I run across in my work out with private landowners across Oklahoma. The main portion of our client base is really in the OKC metro, but we do have clients as far away as Enid, Durant, Altus. We have a lot of individuals up in the Tulsa area. So we do try to provide services for as much of the state as possible for a small business. But the things I'm going to talk about here today are largely based on the things that we see in the OKC area. So title of my presentation is The Golf Course Effect, Other Poor Practices in Private Ponds. So what I see out there and how do we encourage landowners to be responsible stewards and use best management practices. So, oh, it's not going. Oh, let me just see if it'll do it this way. Uh-oh, no, he's kind of frozen. There it goes. Okay, so what is the golf course effect? Essentially, this is a phrase that we've coined ourselves to sort of give a visual image of the collection of poor practices that we see often in private landowners' ponds, especially neighborhood ponds. And they've sort of become a standard in management in the landscape of pond and lake management in Oklahoma and other states as well. It's kind of like when you get a new car and then you see that car everywhere on the road. Once I started doing this, I noticed ponds and commercials and movies and posters and things and noticed that it's not just Oklahoma that has this issue. It seems to be sort of a landscape of pond management across the whole country. And so this photo, I will say this is the only photo in the whole presentation that is not my own. And while this is a very gorgeous, highly edited, stylized photo of a golf course pond, it does look beautiful on the standalone. If you're just the average individual that doesn't really see things the way that we see them as scientists or people that work in this field, you know, you got this beautiful bright green grass and it's mowed to the edge and, there's no aquatic plants. And, on the surface, that may seem like a very appealing pond system. So that being said, here is the not so stylized version of a pond that uses those similar types of practices. So some examples that I have listed here, obviously we see over and over again, mowing to the edge, allowing vegetation to become invasive, which that's not necessarily something you can see here very well because of the turbidity, but underneath that murky water, there's actually a lot of coontail that's growing. And, submerged aquatic vegetation is often a problem. You have a prolific overuse of chemicals as the sole source of managing problems in ponds, and removal of any of your native aquatic vegetation. As you can see here, there's no emergent aquatic vegetation along the shoreline. It's all been removed either with chemicals or it's been mowed down. So, you can see the difference in what an actual poorly managed pond looks like versus the stylized Golf Digest version of that type of management. So what are some of the impacts that I see of these poor management practices? And I have this broken up into sort of 3 different categories, and there is a little bit of overlap. But essentially, this first slide is probably the best example of what I see over and over again. If you're not aware, I'm sure that you are, that is a really bad blue-green algae bloom. That's microcystis. And this neighborhood had been using the same management company for years, that their only sole source of managing any kind of ponds and problems in ponds is to spray chemicals. And they spray largely copper sulfate on a monthly basis, to the point to where you end up with this, a symptom of trophic collapse is this blue-green algae bloom, largely due to, overuse of chemicals. Eutrophication starts occurring. You get these increased green algae blooms at first. They try to control them with copper sulfate. Then you shift the balance of the competitive nature of a balanced system over to predominant blue-green algae blooms, which ends up causing low dissolved oxygen, and you disrupt your microbiome. So if you know anything about copper sulfate, that is sort of the long-term effects of using it over and over is, yes, it does kill green algae. That's what it's designed to do. It's very good at doing that, but it also kills your good beneficial bacteria, and it kills your good plankton that you need to create a balanced system. So what you end up with is these persistent, reoccurring blue-green algae blooms that just don't go away. And not only do they look terrible, they smell terrible, but there's also always that potential of them actually becoming toxic. So unlike green algae, as we know, blue-green algae does have that capacity to create toxins directly. So then more of like a physical problem that we see over and over again is sort of related to the mowing to the edge. You mow to the edge over and over and over again. You undermine the root system of the plants that are keeping that shoreline in place on the terrestrial edge of the shoreline. And inevitably, you're going to end up with bank erosion, bank collapse. That, of course, lends itself to increased sedimentation, which lends itself to increased runoff during rain events, turbidity, and even in worst case scenario, you can end up with a problem with your dam being undermined or even breaching altogether. So this, in terms of management, is something where even if you stop mowing to the edge immediately, you could still have enough undercutting and enough damage that your banks are going to be at risk. And obviously, as we know, riprap, shoreline restoration or rebuilding shorelines is a very expensive process. So if we can avoid that, we definitely want to. Okay, and then the last sort of category is just straight up wildlife effects, species collapse, where you have eutrophication, increased blue-green algae, you get low DO, you end up with fish kill events. And we do see this quite often, especially with this other service provider that does a lot of business in this area that likes to over apply chemicals, is the pond will get to the point where they have one or two or more fish kill events, and the other service provider doesn't know what to do, doesn't know how to fix it, doesn't want to take responsibility for it, and the landowners are left with the consequences. So it's heartbreaking to me to lose fish. That's never something you want to see. It's also just sort of an undue burden and undue cost from poor management. When you are mowing to the edge, you're not allowing your aquatic vegetation to thrive. Of course, you're going to lose native species, not just your fish. You lose species of bacteria. You lose your invertebrates. You overall lose biodiversity. The diversity is going to be reduced because you're essentially homogenizing the system and eliminating the competitive levels that make it balanced. And all of this, of course, just leads to an increased vulnerability to pollution. If you have a degraded system, then there are a lot of different factors that can cause it to either sequester more toxins. You have poor water quality, you have turbidity, and I think I go into that a little bit more on my next slide here. Let me see. But what are some of these cumulative effects? Like I've mentioned, overall poor water quality, you have increased nutrient loading, you have low DO, you have toxins that accumulate, whether it's heavy metals, whether it's herbicide residuals, you have foul odors, whether it's just from the muck that's accumulating, blue-green algae itself, when you have these big blooms, smells awful. You have these undermined banks or banks that collapse. You have increased sedimentation that actually decreases your volume in that pond, which can inadvertently increase your flooding risks. These retention, detention ponds are built and designed to hold a certain amount of water. And if you increase the sedimentation rate above what that lifespan of that pond is designed to be, then you are putting your landowners at risk for increased flooding. And then this is sort of the kicker of why I don't understand why this look is so valued, because the cumulative effects is, you can see in this photograph that big green algae bloom that was going, sorry, I didn't mean to, I hit the screen, so it wanted to go forward, is in a decreased property value. And I don't need to go back. It's fine.
Okay.
So let's just go through an overview of some of the best management practices that can help correct some of these issues. And there is some overlap in some of these slides, but as we know, everything is connected. So I've tried to break these up the best way that I can, but essentially some of the goals of using best management practices versus just chemical only management or just outright negligence in general. There is something to be said for letting things be natural and letting things be wild, but in order to have the greatest benefit to an impoundment, it is most often a benefit to have usefulness of some kind, depending on what the neighborhood is, or at least have it designed or be used as it was designed to hold water. So if you are negligent to the point to where you lose volume because there's too many plants, overgrowth that has not been managed at all, then you're counterproductive to the intended goal of that watershed pond or impoundment in general. So obviously we want to improve water quality. We want to enhance or maintain biodiversity. We want to improve the ecosystem health of the pond. And of course, that has effects on the watershed itself. So we want to make sure that we're also protecting the watershed. We want to provide habitat. And of course, recreational activities are super important, depending on what the neighborhood allows or wants to use the pond for. And then one of the most important things for most individuals that don't care about all the rest is to reduce cost of management. Okay, so the first category that I've outlined here for best management practices is the management of the nutrient loading. So that's obviously something we're super aware of. Eutrophication is a huge problem, not just in Oklahoma, not just in the United States, but worldwide. The overall effects of eutrophication are going to have a lasting and unfortunate consequence in terms of what we see in our waterways. And I try to hit this home as much as possible, but these little ponds are very much like canaries in the coal mine for bigger waters. What we're seeing on a smaller scale eventually will reach a bigger scale if we don't start small. It's all connected, like I keep saying. So we want to make sure that we are trying our best to limit or reduce eutrophication that's already started to occur. So one of the best ways that we can do that is we want to limit chemical use. If at all possible, get to the point to where you don't need chemicals. Control aquatic vegetation. If it is like the coontail, submerged aquatic vegetation can become problematic and reduce your volume and create issues with decomposition when it starts to accumulate. It is definitely something that can impede your recreational activities. You want to establish vegetative buffers. So, and this photo is a good example of leaving some of the aquatic vegetation, and I'll get to this here in a second, but controlling fertilizer runoff is a huge issue. Obviously, a lot of neighborhoods do fertilize their lawns, and if they don't fertilize directly, they are subject to the fertilizer runoff from the watershed. So if we can convince people to reduce their fertilizer use, install bottom-up aeration. So that's what this photograph is of, is an aerator in a little pond that we started working on. So this is sort of at the beginning of restoration. You can see it's still very much covered with these emergents, but luckily for us, this is a little area that is a point where the water enters, and the landowners were okay with us allowing some of this vegetation to remain in place because we don't want to remove all of the aquatic vegetation. Of course, we want to have some nutrient filtration potential. And then we want to utilize nutrient sequestration methods. So I know one of the big ones that we hit home about a lot, obviously, nitrogen and phosphorus are the main components that we're attacking when we talk about nutrient management. But even more important than the nitrogen is really the phosphorus. So if we can reduce and at least get phosphorus loading under control, then that can help with the rest of the issues that we see. And so we have done a little bit of work with like Phoslock, which is a lanthanum bound to bentonite. It's a slurry that you apply to help actually lock out the phosphorus, but that is expensive, and it's also one that, you know, it is still a heavy metal. We talk about copper sulfate, and, you know, that's a heavy metal based aquatic algicide that can leave residual. Well, in the studies that I've read, you know, there is always a concern that anything that has a heavy metal will leave behind a trace of those heavy metals. So I'm not real sold on the Phoslock. So we're looking at some other technologies like biochar, which is essentially just like a charcoal filter for a fish tank. So implementing some of those nutrient sequestration methods can be super important. And then biological control. So things like probiotics, or a big thing now is stocking tilapia, not just for bass food, which is what a lot of the anglers will buy tilapia for, but they are detritivores. So they can help with the muck and detritus. They eat algae, they eat blue-green algae, we know now. So there was always sort of this colloquial knowledge that they would do that, but now we actually have the studies that show that they will predate on microcystis and other species of cyanobacteria. So, yes, ma'am.
Does it make the fish toxic to eat if they're eating the toxic algae?
That's a good question. I would imagine that it's something that's metabolized, but I honestly don't know the answer to that, because a lot of times if that's what we're using them for, the detritus management, then they're not really being utilized as a food source. A lot of times they're not being targeted for angling, but that's a good question. I probably need to make sure that there's not, but I would assume that if they were still that if they still had those high toxin loads, that they themselves would be affected. But that's a good question. I'll follow up on that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the bioaccumulation or biomagnification is definitely an issue and something that we worry about, especially in your predator species like bass. That's largely more of an issue for the heavy metals, especially like mercury, lead, cadmium. I would assume copper is up there too. Um, those and the only one that I know of for sure that biomagnifies then is the mercury that becomes methylated, but all of those heavy metals have the potential to accumulate up the trophic scale. So, okay. So like I said, there is a little bit of overlap, but as far as nutrient management goes, that's sort of a rundown of some of the methods we have available. Of course, shoreline management is going to go hand in hand with that. More healthy and intact shoreline is going to do a better job at filtering nutrients during rain events because you have a buffer, a riparian buffer to actually catch and slow down use nutrients before they enter the pond, reduce sediment loading by catching sediment or grass clippings or whatever, trash sometimes too. So you want to get those vegetative buffers back, stop mowing to the edge. And I like to tell my landowners, just because you don't mow to the edge doesn't mean you can't manicure. It can look nice. It doesn't have to look raggedy, but if you're mowing over and over again, you do undermine the root system of those grasses and cause them to be weaker, which can accelerate your bank and shoreline collapse or undermining. Encourage your aquatic vegetation. So I have to explain to my landowners, there's the wet edge of your shoreline and there's the dry edge of your shoreline, and you need vegetation on both sides of that. And the literature does say that you want at least 30% of your total shoreline to have that emergent aquatic vegetation. And a lot of people fight back on that. I don't know what this predominance of thought is of less vegetation is better, but I try to encourage them, if we can at least hit that 30%, I'll be happier. But if we can do more, then that's obviously going to help you more. So we want to protect our shorelines if they're already undermined or collapsing, which can get very expensive very fast. So if we can reduce that damage or keep it from happening in the first place, it's going to reduce your cost greatly than if you have to actually repair or rebuild shorelines with riprap or shore socks. And then, of course, one of the other ways to protect your shorelines is to control beavers and muskrats, which we actually have a whole lot of in Oklahoma City. So we get calls about beaver trapping quite a bit throughout the year. And my husband is a certified trapper, and he generally takes about 50 beavers a year. So that's a lot of activity that can additionally undermine your shorelines and cause issues with dams and holes along the shoreline. Muskrats are really bad about that. Okay, so of course we had talked about when you lose wildlife diversity, you have fish kill events. So if we talk about the majority of use for ponds, especially urban neighborhood ponds, that's not the fishing isn't a huge concern. So obviously we do want to restock fish if they're lost, but that's sort of something that isn't a main concern until they have a fish kill event. So I'm not focusing a whole lot on the fish aspect, but some of the other parts of this is to restore the microbiome. So one of the ways that we can do that is by the installation of the aeration system. Not only does that eliminate your stagnation and stratification, it helps to create these interstitial spaces in the substrate that can create better habitat for your beneficial bacteria. As you get accumulation of muck and detritus at the bottom, all of that stuff goes through that process of liquefaction where it just becomes sort of a sludge muck layer that doesn't have a lot of oxygen. So over time, you lose your beneficial bacteria, and largely that layer is inhabited by your anaerobic bacteria instead, which greatly reduce the rate of decomposition and can further add to the accumulation by slowing down the rate at which it's going to decompose and be removed from the system. We want to remove non-native species. So if possible, you know, we do get a lot of Eurasian water milfoil, or we see a lot of the non-native reed, the giant reed that's starting to become super prevalent around ponds, which is very gregarious and can become very problematic in terms of access or just overloading the system with decomposing matter as it grows and dies. We want to encourage our native species. Of course, you know, you see this photograph of this native mussel here. Those are definitely an indicator species of water quality. So we want to make sure that we're protecting species that are possibly vulnerable to poor water quality. And like I had said, the aeration is going to go a long way to increasing your water quality and providing good habitat for fish and other aquatic organisms. Getting your vegetative buffers can definitely help to encourage biodiversity by giving habitat to a lot of inverts. And of course, other animals like to utilize those as well. And then controlling sediment, which goes back to our shoreline protection and reducing bank erosion. So that's sort of a brief overview of some of those best management practices. But the real challenge is, how do we get our landowners to get on board with this? And I know I'm probably about to run out of time here, but essentially the pushback that we get a lot is that the golf course effect has taken such a hold on people's brain that they don't understand that what they see as this beautiful manicured pond to me looks like a nightmare. As an ecologist, it looks like an unhealthy, unsustainable system that is going to cost them money in the long run to restore if it persists in that condition over a long period of time. So how do we appeal to landowners to transition away from these non-productive or even negligent practices and adopt our best management practices? And one of the first things that we try to appeal to is just this innate desire for healthy, sustainable watershed or healthy, sustainable pond or lake. You know, when you tell people you can do things in a more natural way, a lot of times they're receptive to it. Most people do not want to be exposed to a bunch of chemicals all the time. So they don't necessarily want their pond to be exposed to chemicals all the time. And they do want healthy ponds and watersheds. So if you really try to hit home that not only does this whole system create an undue sort of exposure to these chemicals, it is not healthy, it's not sustainable. You know, it's safer for you to be around. It's safer for your kids to be around. It's safer for the wildlife. It's more sustainable than chemicals. And of course, like this picture shows, this is in that little area that the aerator was in, where you have this monarch. You know, you have a species of special concern that could potentially be supported by increasing the health and using best management practices. So you have wildlife effects from encouraging healthy, sustainable methods. Obviously, there's a desire for aesthetics. So this, I think, is one of the biggest hurdles that I run across, is trying to teach people what a healthy pond should look like, and that a healthy pond is way more beautiful. I truly dislike the look of these golf course type managed ponds. I think they're ugly, but people have this idea of that's what it's supposed to look like. So that is sort of a challenge, is re-educating people on what a sustainable, healthy, natural pond should look like. So, you know, this photo of this water lily here, obviously there is inherent beauty in a lot of these aquatic plants. They have beautiful flowers, they smell nice, they create a green aspect that is often lacking when you have mowed to the edge and removed all the vegetation. And so one of the highlights then is if we can't appeal to their love of nature or to get them on board with the beauty of a natural pond, aesthetically pleasing, healthy ponds actually increase your property value. If you have a property that is by a pond and the pond is in bad condition, that can actually decrease your property value anywhere up to like 22%, I think is the last quote that I saw from the Neighborhood Alliance. And, you know, in general, most humans do appreciate wild spaces that look more natural. So appealing to that is part of the goal with this is encouraging landowners to see that as beautiful. And then of course, your recreation, you know, better fishing, safer swimming, which obviously isn't the main goal, but there are some of these larger, older impoundments and neighborhoods that people swim in. And if you're constantly running the risk of blue-green algae, that's not a super safe situation. And of course, if you have an overgrowth of algae, it's hard to go boating. You can't really paddle a canoe or a kayak. And then just the inherent value of being in touch with nature and being close to water, you know, all of these factors sort of play into how we try to appeal to landowners to make them understand that this is a better deal for them. And if we can't get there with any of those three categories, then we have to hit them where it's probably the most important most of the time, is just overall, it's going to reduce your cost. Degraded ponds are expensive to maintain. Chemical treatments alone are expensive. If you're spending money on chemicals every month that basically just do nothing but harm your pond, then you're wasting money. It's that there's no easy way to put it. You are literally throwing money away that could be used to go towards these sustainable methods instead. Now, don't get me wrong. Installing an aeration system is an upfront cost, and it can be quite expensive depending on how big your pond is. But long term, it's going to save you the costs of all of these chemical treatments that do nothing but exacerbate the problem long term. So would you rather have an upfront cost that keeps you from having to do monthly maintenance to where you pretty much just let it go? You maybe have to mess with it here and there, but overall, it's not near the cost of what people are wasting on these monthly treatments that do nothing. Rebuilding shorelines, riprap, shore socks, those are way more expensive sometimes than even an aeration system would be. If you have a full-scale shoreline or your dam breaches, you have to rebuild a dam, then your costs go up exponentially at that point. Dredging is super expensive. Fish are very expensive. Fish are one of the most expensive. I mean, aside from these like aeration systems, fish are one of the most expensive single components of management that we buy. They're more expensive by the weight than a lot of the chemicals are even. So obviously, like I said, upfront costs to implement these may be higher, but if you try to encourage people, well, if you keep going the route you're going, the pond is going to collapse. You're going to have to do the restoration anyway. So would you rather keep wasting the money on things that don't work, or sort of bite the bullet, put that chunk of change towards real management that's going to give you long-term benefits and then reap the rewards? So that's about all I've got. I could keep talking about this all day long, but that's sort of the trials and tribulations of what we run into a lot on the private side. And it is a challenge to try to appeal to people and get them to shy away from these practices that just aren't going to give great benefit and in fact do ecological damage. So any questions, or do I have time for questions?
Hey, Amie, I have a question. So the predictions are out that this spring is going to be drier than last spring. So what are your recommendations to landowners, you know, knowing that this might be an even drier spring as far as pond management?
Well, I would say that one of the things I never want to do is make a recommendation for, let's say, an aeration system, it would be a good time to do some shoreline repair. It would be a good time to do some dredging if they lose volume and they can access areas that were underwater, but you never want to plan that water levels are going to be low forever. So you always still want to make your recommendations as if the whole pond is full, so that if you do choose to use that time to install something like an aeration system, then the pond fills back up. You may not have adequate volume for that body of water. But I would say that that's a good time to also address, if you have like the invasive reed we were talking about, trying to get that under control. But I also have this horrible gut feeling that the droughts are going to continue. So I would also caution people to be prepared for low dissolved oxygen. Obviously, if you have a smaller body of water, then all of your nutrients are then sort of, they're concentrated. So you can have greater algae blooms. You can have a higher risk of fish kill events if you do not have aeration in place, because then all of your volume, all your substrate, all of your microbiome interactions are then limited by the reduced volume. So I don't know. That's a good question. It's something that we're definitely going to run up against, and I don't think it's going to go away as the years go by. So did that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, I was just curious, like, if you kind of know the predictions of what, the weather's going to be like, right, for say the next 3 months, like what can you offer in terms of advice and management to your landowners? So yeah, that was good.
Yeah. What were you going to say?
Okay, I have two questions. First part, do you know the average cost for installing an aerator? I know they're super expensive. Second part, do you help with erosion on private property creek banks, or is it just for ponds?
No, we work on watersheds, streams, ponds, and I mean, waterways in general. It's just that the majority of the clients that we deal with have ponds rather than creeks or streams. The average cost for an aeration system is dependent upon the volume of water. So for like an acre pond, and it also depends on the shape and the depth. So you have different systems. You have shallow water systems and deep water systems. So if you have more than an average 8-foot depth, you need a deep water system, which is going to be a little bit more expensive. But fully installed, you're looking at somewhere around $3,500 to $5,000. But I mean, that's a system that can run for an indefinite period of time because it's just a small air compressor. And even if that air compressor fails, then they're very easy to fix. So we generally project that those systems can last for 10 years or more. And generally there's a pretty good warranty on your tubing that feeds the diffusers that sit at the bottom. That can be, I think it's 5 years usually on the tubing. A lot of the compressors have a 2-year warranty. The diffusers have a couple-year warranty. So, I mean, for that kind of cost, a lot of people are spending anywhere from $100 to $300 per acre for management for monthly costs for just chemicals anyway. So if you add up all of the years that a lot of these neighborhoods have been spending money on these monthly treatments, they could have bought 3 aeration systems a lot of times, or at least funded one aeration system. And so when you tell them, you've all of this money that you've spent, you don't get back, and now you still have to do the aeration. It's a little bit difficult, but a lot of times people will get the idea, especially when they see the results. So thank you guys. Well, definitely get in touch with me if you ever need any assistance. Good deal.
Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you. All right, up next is Kimberly Elkin. Kimberly has worked in the environmental realm for 22 years. She has a Master of Science in Zoology and Ichthyology and a Master of Science in Water Resources Policy and Management. Her Bachelor of Science degree is in Environmental Biology. All right, with that, we can see your slides, so please take it away.
All right, awesome. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today, and hello, everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about ecosystem services for stormwater management. And for those of you that might not be familiar with the term ecosystem services, in simplest form, it's just the benefits nature provides to us, right? Those benefits for free. And so one of the things I wanted to show you about this spring-fed pond is, there's a lot of, like what Amie talked about, a lot of vegetation missing from it. And so what do you think? This is just, you don't have to like answer the question, but just think of it in your mind. Like, what do you think one of the main issues is with this pond? This is actually in Oklahoma in Seminole County.
They're mowing to the edge.
Mowing to the edge.
Yep.
Yeah.
And, they have a lot of erosion issues going on. They've been trying to control it, putting up these filter socks to control it, and it's not helping. So there's a lot of issues going on here with that. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there in the beginning. This is a lot of stuff that we see and hope that by incorporating ecosystem services, we could improve some of these areas. All right, so this are the 4 pillars of ecosystem services. So you have your provisioning, so things like clean water, fish, wood, pollination, and then your regulating services where, the forest provides your cooler temperatures, it can help control flooding, purifying the water, storing carbon, and cleaner air. So a lot of things that nature provides us, within those provisioning and regulating services we have. And if we can utilize those things, that would be, the best outcome for a lot of these watersheds. And then you have your cultural aspects, so your stewardship, the aesthetics, the recreation, all those things that we like to do, as well as education, which is something all of us in this room like to provide as much information as possible to help make better land management and water resource decisions. And then your supporting aspect of that. So the habitat that exists, the biological diversity, photosynthesis, soil formation, and then the food that we all benefit from. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen this graphic, this whole stormwater, where it flows, everything goes. This is from EPA. And so you just think about all of these things that can end up in our waterways. What are some ways that we could use ecosystem services? And especially, one of the things that a lot of people use are the green infrastructure, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Like, how can we utilize those things, especially in these urban environments where we see a lot of these issues, from the lawn fertilizer to the pesticides, a lot of things that Amie's already covered. Cigarette butts, we all know those can be around for a long time. Various forms of trash, oil and grease. Every time I go to like the gas station, I try my hardest not to like drip gasoline, right? Because they're like, oh, even if just a little drip gets on the ground, it's going to end up in the water. And then pet waste, of course, is a big one. And then a lot of people don't think about car washing, but every time I go by a car wash, I'm just like, oh, what chemicals, are going to end up in the water from that. So, yeah. And so with that, it's kind of, there's been a lot of research, a lot of things that have gone on in different areas across the country as far as ecosystem services and green infrastructure. So really focusing in on these conservation areas and forested land, parks, a big one with the urban tree canopy. We always hear about the urban heat island effect and what could we do more in these areas where, especially in places like Oklahoma City, where it gets so hot in the summer, like what could we do differently, in terms of putting some more trees up or even just some vegetation to help cool things down even just a little bit. Rain barrels is a big one. Green roofs. I actually just saw an interesting article out of Switzerland where they've been installing a lot more green roofs in that country and seeing a lot of the benefits. So for instance, like if there's a development that's gone on, they'll go ahead and use some of that soil from that development and put it on the roof and then start, a garden that way to help with some of the heating and cooling, effects that are going on, helping with that, manage that more like in the summertime, but also the aesthetics of it, right? If you live in an urban environment, just being able to see a green roof from your window can help, with the aesthetics part of that. And then rain gardens, which we'll touch on. We kind of use it interchangeably, the pollinator garden / rain garden. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Permeable pavement. I know you guys are familiar probably with the pervious pavement. It's my understanding that there are a lot of vehicles. There's a certain weight restriction on that. So you'll see a lot of this more like in parks where people are walking. Your stormwater curb extensions, tree planter boxes, and then these vegetative swales. And I know a lot of people will talk about bioswales and rain gardens kind of interchangeably, but we'll talk about those here in a minute. So, like I said, looking at more of this green stormwater infrastructure and ecosystem services, from your bioswales to your retention basins, you see a lot of those in neighborhoods, retention basins, wetlands. One of the things I learned about Oklahoma after being here for, well, I guess it's going on 13 years, that we only have 2%, I think, of our wetlands left. So anything we can do to kind of keep what's remaining and restore what we can across the state would be great. Rain gardens, and then your urban green space. So just kind of jumping into it, you see a lot of bioswales, particularly near parking lots. You see where they have like these plugs throughout the blanket of it, this ponding area, kind of this depression in here. They have erosion control blankets as part of it, mulch. I know that University of Oklahoma, they do a lot of the green infrastructure stuff there with Dr. Jason Bogle. And then, tying in these geotextiles. So something like this could be implemented in Oklahoma City and surrounding areas. I'm sure that it has been, and I know that there's a conference that takes place in Oklahoma City, or it has in the past, where they talk about a lot of these green infrastructure type projects. And so retention basins, I know Amy's familiar with those, with working with ponds in her business. And you see a lot of these in homeowners associations where you have like the low flow channel in there that flows into the pond. You have your control structure, and then, whenever those big stormwater events happen, then that can be slowly kind of released out of that outlet pipe there on the downstream end to kind of let that water filter and then get into the streams and other draining water bodies. So this is something that's pretty common to control stormwater as well. Wetlands, like I said, these areas where you have certain types of soils, certain type of plants, a little bit of water that's in there. Some of them are seasonal, some of them are permanent. Really, encouraging as much wetland restoration as we can across the state, because I know historically there's been a huge decline in wetlands in Oklahoma. And then urban green space, which is a big thing, for people living in these urban environments. Just having these areas to go to can help deal with the hustle and bustle of life as well. And then one of the things I want to talk about, so like I said, we kind of use this rain garden, pollinator garden thing interchangeably, where rain gardens are typically like there's a depression, whether it's natural or man-made, where you can allow these native plants to filter stormwater. But we've also implemented pollinator gardens. This one is actually at the Pauls Valley Municipal Golf Course. Lots of native plants. We used Wild Things Nursery in Seminole, in addition to Johnson Seed Company in Enid. And so these are a lot of the different types of blooms that we got within this garden. They had a lot of stormwater issues. They were really wanting to improve some areas around the golf course. So we had 10 different areas that we focused on our efforts. And so like you can see here, this is more like your pollinator garden, more like your typical garden. But then the picture there in the middle at the bottom, that's more of like a depression area where we were able to plant some seeds and put some native plants in there, and focused on really, talking to them about the management that goes on at the golf course. Amie talking about the golf course effect and how things should look. And so they finally had a manager that came into the golf course that was open to new ideas and willing to do something different to make the golf course better and to help with some of the stormwater issues that they have. And so these are a lot of the native plants that we put in. We created a booklet for them that's available in the clubhouse that shows them the different type of plants that they see. And maybe this will encourage them, some of the patrons, to create their own pollinator gardens / rain gardens in their private residence areas. A lot of interest in it. So we also were able to work with some private landowners. This is actually with Ada Girl Scouts. Both Amie and Jared were able to help with that, where they had some stormwater issues, water running down into a headwater stream. They had a lot of issues on their land, and so we were able to put in a couple native rain gardens / pollinator gardens that helped with that. But, one of the things that we really try to talk with people about is just this, educational component, like what we do on the land and how that impacts stream health. So once we kind of put in those gardens, we went to the stream, we did water quality, we looked at the macroinvertebrates, we just had that conversation about like, look, if we can do these things on the land, it's going to improve the stream, tie that into the types of critters that we find in the stream, and how that is going to impact overall watershed health. As you can see, we're in there, we found some critters in the stream, and then we go up on the bank and have a conversation about, what do these indicator species mean in the stream as far as the health is concerned, and, tie that into what we did with that private residence. And so you can see here, we do our water quality measurements, show them how that all ties in. This one is for dissolved oxygen, but we had several parameters that we looked at and then tied that into, the types of species that we were finding in that stream. And so one of the things we've also been working on is with homeowners associations, putting in pollinator gardens. This is in an urban environment. Actually, this is in South Carolina, just outside of, well, Charlotte is right there on the border, right? North South Carolina, but a lot of people, it's very much hustle and bustle there, even more so than Oklahoma City. And so getting people interested in these homeowners associations with what they could do with a pollinator garden. I think it'll be a year in April since we put in about 22 different plant species. So I'm excited to see the results of that. Lots of people asking like, what is this? How does this all tie in? Thinking about it from an ecosystem service standpoint and the food that's provided. I mean, just having those conversations with people, a lot of people don't think about the pollination and the food and, I get my food from these different pollinators that are helping create these resources that we take for granted on a daily basis. So, we've worked a little bit on high school education and water quality. So going in and just having conversations about watershed health, like I said, the land management aspect of it, and tying that into water quality. And so people can see the results, like what is a healthy stream or a healthy pond, and how all that water quality ties into it as well. And the other thing that we've been able to do here recently are some water camps. This is actually the Blue River, just south of Ada. And one of the things that I like to talk to people about is, so you think about it from an ecosystem service standpoint and how we can do that and clean up stormwater, particularly in urban environments. But then when you come to rural areas and you see that difference in water quality, because you have more of a vegetative buffer, as you can see along the stream back there behind everybody. And then a lot of these people haven't even spent time in streams or rivers, didn't even know places like this existed in Oklahoma. And then you show them like, these are the critters that are here. This is what it means for watershed health. That gets them thinking about these things and like, hey, what kinds of projects could I do in my area? And how this all ties in, and what am I doing on my own private residence that I could do differently to improve water quality as it leaves and enters whatever watershed they happen to be in. And so that brings me to this whole, just giving people that river experience, or getting them out to a pond in an urban environment, or even a stream. Like I said, a lot of people haven't had these experiences, so they don't realize, the critters that are in there tie into the whole ecosystem services and the health of a watershed. And so when you see something like this, like, you see the picture of the river and you're like, oh, well, there's these species in there, and what do they mean? And how does that tie into all of this? It's a different conversation and a different perspective, and people think about things differently. And therefore, it's our hope that they're going to do things differently as they participate in activities on land and in the water. And so some of the things I just kind of want to wrap up with, I know that, we've all talked about riparian buffers. We're all probably pretty familiar with them. But as you can see with this, you have the water there in the middle, the stream channel, and then on either side is the riparian buffer, right? Like, I understand in a lot of urban environments, it can be challenging to even have, a certain amount of width. But if there's one thing that we can get people to do, is having some sort of a vegetative / tree buffer, riparian buffer along these waterways, it's going to help improve water quality. Therefore, it's going to help kind of reduce some of these impacts of stormwater and what, a lot of these water filtration plants have to filter out in these, for water that's provided for us on a daily basis, right? So really thinking about that riparian area. What could I do in my homeowners association in this area where the stream is? Is there a way that we could make this buffer a little better? Maybe put in a pollinator garden or rain garden, things like that. And then, thinking about the uplands, like what is happening further away from the stream? Like, do you see issues that are going on? And, what are ways that we can improve upon these areas within these areas where we live and work? So I really like to emphasize, like Amie did, about really protecting our streamside buffers. I like to show this picture of a lot of disturbance going along this. You can't see the stream, but along, beyond those trees, there's a stream there, and you see a lot of this impact here. And so you think about, like, when a big stormwater event does happen, a lot of that sediment is going to end up right in the stream, even though there are trees there to kind of slow it down. You got your roots there in the stream bank. You're still going to have some sort of impact, especially with like these big extreme rainfall events that we get. And so really, talking to people about why is it important? Filtering excess sediment, organic material, nutrients, chemicals, like Amie talked about, reducing these storm runoff velocities, providing flood protection, looking at scour and erosion and how to reduce that, providing shade. That's a big thing, right? Having cooler water temperatures, especially in the summertime. It's going to help with your dissolved oxygen. And then really, providing leaf litter and the large woody debris, which is important to some of those aquatic organisms like I showed in previous slides. And really just overall improving that stream bank is going to help the aquatic habitat, therefore the watershed health. And that's all I have. I just really wanted to, talk about this ecosystem services, benefits nature provides, what we could do differently to clean up stormwater, and then really tying in the educational aspect of it to show that there are ways that we can get people to think about things differently and hopefully do things differently on their land. Or even just within their own homeowners association. And that's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Kim. Does anybody in the audience here have any questions for Kim?
Can you go back to the last slide so I can get our email?
Oh,
Yep.
oh, yeah. Oopsie, hold on.
That was a great presentation.
Cheryl says it was a great presentation.
Yay, thank you. All right.
I'm sure
All right,
Amy would
there we go.
agree. I'm sure Amy would agree, but she had to step away, so
Yeah, I know that. Can you-
she's writing it down. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions in the audience? All right, well, thank you so much.
All right, let's see if I can stop sharing the.
And with that, we're going to take about a 7-minute break. We'll start back up at 2:45. And with Cheryl Cheadle's presentation here, we've got a hands-on workshop. So I'm going to try to record that as well. We'll just see how that works. Haven't done that before, so fingers crossed. All right, thanks again, Kimberly. Talk
All right.
soon.
All right, thank you.